Hello, I'm back with another rotten read. This one is from a book, and it's called Children, Doctors, Big Pharma, and the Making of an American Epidemic. It's by Alan Schwartz. I won't be reading the entire book. I just wanted to read just a little bit. It's from 2016, and this is the opinions and ideas of the author. Keep that in mind. Let's go. Well, we'll just skim through the chapters. So we've got Fidgety Phil's Arithmetic Pills. That's the one we're going to read. It starts on page 13. How perfect is that? We've got some children that are named the hijacking. There's something they know about us, and some other things awakening. And now a word from our sponsor, Bright College Days, higher and higher. And then we also have chapter 17 there. Okay, let's go through this. This is an ADHD nation. Some of you may have heard of this book before. I know I've never read it, but I had heard of it before. So I'll just start here with the introduction. Attention deficit. Let me see, I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger. Fill my screen. I do that. Will it get bigger? No. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is real. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. A boy who careens frenziedly around homes and busy streets can endanger himself and others. A girl who cannot, even for 2 minutes, sit and listen to her teachers will never not learn. An adult who lacks the concentration to complete health insurance forms accurately will fail the demands of modern life. When a person of any age has a combination of these struggles severely enough to impair his daily functioning, with no other plausible explanation for them, then he could very well have a serious, if still somewhat mysterious, condition that medicine has decided to call ADHD. No one quite knows what causes it. The most commonly cited theory is that hyperactivity, lack of focus, and impulsivity are classic ADHD result from some sort of dysfunction among chemicals and synapses in the brain. A person's environment clearly plays a role as well. A chaotic home, an inflexible classroom, or a distracting workplace can all induce or exacerbate symptoms. Unfortunately, as with many psychiatric illnesses such as depression or anxiety, there's no definitive way to diagnose ADHD. No blood test or CAT scan that lets doctors declare, okay, there it is. All one can do is thoughtfully assess whether the severity of the behavior warrants a diagnosis. After all, we're all distractible and impulsive to varying degrees. One thing is certain, though, there's no cure for ADHD. Someone with the disorder might learn to adapt to it, perhaps with the help of medication, but patients, young and old, are generally told that they have to deal with their abnormal brain for the rest of their lives. As for medications, for a long time, Ritalin, and now primarily Adderall, Concerta, and Vyvanse, they quite remarkably improved concentration and impulse control. Not unlike the painkiller Oxycontin and anti-anxiety agents like Valium, they are powerful drugs that can be dangerous and addictive, particularly when taken improperly. All told, however, they have done considerable more good than harm. They are not the devil's work. If a diagnosis of ADHD has been made by a qualified and responsible health professional, then the decision to seek treatment through medication, either for yourself or your child, is not unreasonable. The American Psychiatric Association's official description of ADHD, confide in the field's top experts and used to guide doctors nationwide, says that the condition affects about 5% of children, primarily boys. Most experts consider this a sensible benchmark. But what's happening in real life America? 15% of youngsters in the United States, 3 times the consensus estimate, are getting diagnosed with ADHD. That's millions of extra kids being told that they have something wrong with their brains, with most of them then placed on serious medications. The rate among boys nationwide is a stunning 20%. In southern states such as Mississippi, South Carolina, and Arkansas, it's 30% of all boys, almost 1 in 3. Boys tend to be more hyperactive and impulsive than girls, whose ADHD can manifest itself more in an inability to concentrate. Some Louisiana counties are approaching half of the boys in third through fifth grades are taking ADHD medications. ADHD has become by far the most misdiagnosed condition in American medicine. Yet, distressingly, few people in the thriving ADHD industry complex acknowledge this reality. Many are well meaning. They see foundering children either in their living rooms, classrooms, or waiting rooms and believe the diagnosis and medication can improve their lives. Others have motives more mixed. Some teachers prefer fewer troublesome students, parents want less clamorous homes, and doctors like the steady stream of easy business. In the most nefarious corner stand the high-profile doctors and researchers bought off by pharmaceutical companies that have reaped billions of dollars from the unchecked and heedless march of ADHD. Some onlookers blame the new millennials' quick fix, just take a pill ethos, or simple internet overload. But the rancor surrounding ADHD, did I say that? Rancor? Sketches back at least half a century, back to when the disorder carried a less remarkable name for minimal brain dysfunction. A congressional hearing in 1970, not long after Ritalin emerged as a way to calm critically hyperactive children, examined whether too many kids were being put on, quote, behavior drugs. As the percentage of children diagnosed increased persistently through the 2000s, media reports staged recurrent tug-of-wars between parents testifying that Adderall was their family's lifeboat and those decrying the over-medication of children. Many claimed that this hostility only stigmatized kids with ADHD and discouraged parents from seeking help. Then again, whatever stigma there was didn't prove any dissuasion. Didn't prove very dissuasive, sorry. Diagnoses have continued to be handed out so blithely at the hint of any problem that today 1 in 7 kids leave high school having been told they have ADHD. 1 in 7. No longer a niche minority, but a sprawling swath of America's future. Shockingly, it's almost certain that kids misdiagnosed with ADHD outnumber those with legitimate clinical problems, leaving the disorder so muddied that no one quite knows what to make of it all. The ADHD explosion has become, to some, literally laughable. Stephen Kober dubbed it meducation and profiled a doctor who prescribed Adderall to children without the disorder simply to improve their grades. Shocking, Colbert says. There are children in America who haven't been diagnosed with ADHD. The Onion's sardonically profiled a 4-year-old girl stricken with, quote, youthful tendency disorder. These ribbings are routinely decried by ADHD support groups as disrespectful. Perhaps, but some advocates also bring satire and skepticism upon themselves with preposterous sales messages, flitting back and forth from asserting the gravity of the condition, which one article says impairs life functioning 24/7, to celebrating its purported positives. Some famous people with ADHD roster claims that Thomas Edison, Abraham Lincoln, Galileo, even Socrates quite possibly suffered from ADHD too, implying that it contributed to their inner genius and encouraging the hesitant to join the very good company, right? But they weren't on medications, were they? Or maybe they were. What were they on? That list now lives on a website surrounded by ads for ADHD medications. A consumer magazine devoted to the disorder, ADDitude, has published we just read something from them. It published its rundowns of 12 amazing ADHD superpowers. Among them, multitasking, laser focus, and a strong moral compass. It's a curious list given that inability to stay on task and uh, deficient focus are among the disorder's official core symptoms. Occupying a uniquely bizarre place in American culture, let alone medicine, ADHD has become the brain disorder some choose to fake. Because Adderall, Concerta, and other drugs can instantly boost a person's motivation and focus, rather for term papers or tax returns. The pills move from medicine to performance enhancing drugs, steroids for the brain. And we do note that there is a lot of college students who will often take Adderall, as we have been learning. Thus, ADHD gets caught in a tenuous balancing act between treating the ill and tempting the healthy, fostering serpious diagnosis, not just among adults who can take themselves to accommodating doctors, but children too, because some parents will exaggerate their child's symptoms to get them a prescription. The doctor nods and says, let's try Concerta and see if it helps. They basically do that constantly. If this medicine works, that's what you have. Let's try this and see if it takes it away. That's guessing. That's guessing. That's not doctoring. When it invariably does, then the child's schoolwork improves, the ADHD diagnosis appears confirmed. Yet the doctor might as well have said, try these platform shoes and see if they make him taller. And so the number of diagnoses only keeps rising to the point where millions of kids today are labeled with a brain disorder they probably do not have, changing their self-image and personal narrative forever. And I wanted to point this out because this is what I'm seeing en masse. I keep bumping into people who openly want to tell me all of their health problems, including I have ADHD. And to someone of my generation, for a 20-something-year-old to come tell me they have ADD, I must laugh at you. So what? Who doesn't? We all do. I have ADD, I'm sure, right? So this changes their self-image and it changes their personal narrative and it makes them continue to live as if they are broken for their entire lives. Yet this doesn't seem to bother a lot of powerful people. A pitch-perfect example came in 2013 when the New York Times broke the news that ADHD diagnosis had reached that staggering 15% of children nationwide, with 20% of boys. A prominent doctor responded in Child Psychiatry's top scientific journal, quote, "These numbers are actually all good news. It appears that we are getting close, after more than 2 decades of advocacy, to identifying and treating a majority of children and adolescents with ADHD." What he and so many others did not see or want to see is that their fervor for finding every kid with even a whiff of ADD has left a lot of dolphins getting caught in their tuna nets. I find this so interesting. So the prologue, rain pelted the white Ford's windshield as it drove up Interstate 684 towards Connecticut. An old man was wedged in the passenger seat. Cane crossed over his creaky legs. The wipers whooshed. The trees rushed past. The man didn't know quite what he was in for. He was intrigued, even excited, but also nervous. Dr. C. Keith Connors had spent more than 50 years as one of the world's most eminent child psychologists, a man renowned for pioneering the recognition of treatment of once unappreciated childhood malady, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. As a young researcher in the early 1960s, Connors had pinpointed just how much a new drug, Ritalin, could calm severely hyperactive and impulsive children. He developed the later marketed a questionnaire to pinpoint a child's symptoms of impulsivity and inattention, helping doctors everywhere diagnose millions of youngsters nationwide. He evaluated new and better drugs on behalf of pharmaceutical companies. Good job. He led the most important studies and headlined the biggest conferences. If one person put ADHD on the map, it was Keith Connors. Yet now, at 83 and barely mobile, Dr. Connors has started to consider his job well done, as done a little too well. When he started and began encouraging doctors to locate and often medicate children with acute issues, he couldn't conceive that in 2015, more than 6 million children would be labeled with ADHD, many of them misdiagnosed by lazy doctors, just checking off boxes on his questionnaire and then prescribing medication with little regard for side effects and risks for abuse. He didn't foresee drug companies contorting his science into shameless advertisements that exploited parents' fears for their children's future, while also promising better grades at school and more chores done at home. Now, Big Pharma's latest frontier was adults, a market ripe for indoctrination. As the car turned toward Hartford, Connors sighed. Quote, "I struck a match, and I didn't know how much tinder there was around." What a comment. Didn't know until recently. Enjoying a comfortable retirement in Durham, North Carolina, Connors has started reading the New York Times articles about improperly diagnosed kids feeling inferior and damaged, college students pulling all-nighters to write term papers and cram for exams, were popping so much Adderall that they became addicted, delusional, and occasionally suicidal and homicidal. I'll add that. High school juniors, menaced by scholastic pressure, were taking and even snorting the drug before SATs. Perhaps most horrifying of all, 10,000 toddlers as young as 2, against all published medical guidelines, were being put on Ritalin to treat their supposed ADHD. 2 years old? Reading about these children roasted not just Connor's curiosity, but also his conscience. So in June of 2015, Connors got himself wheelchaired to the Raleigh-Durham airport for a flight to New York City. The next morning, he was driven up to Connecticut to sit down with 2 children, former children actually, who had become casualties in the medicine's long-time crusade against ADD. One was Kristen Parber, who as a 7-year-old in the late 1990s got diagnosed with ADHD. These are the millennial generation, when she almost certainly did not have it. Distractible, yes. Rambunctious, certainly. But as her parents watched dozens of children in the Philadelphia suburb thrive on Ritalin, they joined the wave. The experiment went fine until it didn't. Turns out that, more than anything else, Kristen had one of those square peg personalities that didn't quite fit her world's round and shrinking holes. The human brain has evolved over many thousands of years, yet only in the last 100, a blip on that timeline, we have demanded that each and every young one sit still and pay attention for 7 hours a day. Kristen couldn't. But was that really her underlying problem? The other was Jameson Moore, down in Houston around the same time that Kristen was being evaluated for ADHD. The only affliction Jameson had was a whopping case of high school pressure syndrome. When his grades began to slip, Jameson tried some of his friends' Adderall and literally overnight began acing his exams again. So he went to his doctor, pretended he had ADHD, and after a careless pseudo evaluation, got himself prescribed steady supplies of Adderall. Jameson's grades kept rising. He loved his Adderall until he loved it just a little too much. Kristen and Jameson crossed paths in 2009, and now all grown up, they're working together in central Connecticut. They wanted to meet Keith Connors as much as he wanted to meet them. Heck, it was Connors' questionnaire that had been used to diagnose them with their purported ADHD in the first place. If Connors' motivation for the three to meet was theirs was more catharsis, whatever those words are. The car pulled away into the driveway in, of all reconciliatory settings, a small town called Bethlehem. Connors took a deep breath and easily hoisted himself out of the car and onto his cane. He toddled up to the gravel driveway, leaning on the cane so hard that his arm shook. Kristen and Jameson warmly greeted their visitor at the door. The three made their way to a room, sank down in their leather chairs, and told their stories. Those tales all descended directly from one moment, 80 years and 2 hours away, when an unknown Rhode Island doctor had some kids who needed help. And then, of course, I've got a bunch of pages missing. Part 1, the ADD Nation. The children become less raucous. They listened. They learned. For perhaps the first time, they enjoyed success, praise, and a drive to perform better in school. I can't seem to do things fast enough today, one child remarked. Another said he had joy in his stomach. They tore through math problems like never before and practiced their handwriting with a focus previously unthinkable. One said, quote, I start to make my bed, and before I knew it, it was done. Some even called their medicine arithmetic pills. I had a personal experience with somebody who took ADHD medications, and their response at a young age was, I can read again. That was how so when I read that, I totally got that, because I heard a child tell me themselves, I can read again. Dr. Bradley was shaken. He and the hospital staff gave these troubled kids the most nurturing environment possible, teaching them new social and behavioral skills so that they could acclimate someday to the outside world. Bradley was not looking for a magic pill and didn't necessarily want one, but as a scientist at heart, he knew his findings deserved more studies. By pure happenstance, Bradley had discovered a way to make children slow down and pay attention, a pursuit as old as parenthood itself. That right there should tell you that there is something wrong with this. Somewhere in what we call France and Spain, an undiscovered Paleolithic walls and ceilings, cave drawings undoubtedly depict boys running wild, obviously to their mother's cries, their antics scaring wild boar away from their father's cocked and poisoned arrows. Irrepressible dark-aged children surely vexed nobles and serfs alike, and for all his renown, Gutenberg had subjected centuries of kids to books on which they would rather not focus. In the Little House on series, and including the one, the Pharma boy, they describe having to sit in church for 2 hours and not be able to move or anything in their seats. And I remember being one of those children, sit in school. And then they came home and went crazy, running around, doing all kinds of chores and getting all of that out of their system. But they weren't allowed to even wiggle in their seats. They must sit there perfectly still, I think the term used in the book. As early Western medicine explored treatments for various ills, it's also ruminated on short attention spans. In a 1775 medical textbook, the German physician, somebody I can't say, posted that an overly distractible person's, quote, fibers, what we would now call nerves or temperament, must not be bewildered or affected by any clamor or by any disturbance. A person with such a constitution, he wrote, studies his matters only superficially, his judgments are erroneous, and his misconceives the worth of things because he does not spend enough time and patience to search a matter individually or by the piece with the adequate accuracy. Such people hear only of half of everything. And so then we get fidgety Phil's arithmetic pills. He recommended that the inattentive person is to be separated from the noise and any other objects. He is to be kept solitary in the dark when he is too active. The earliest careful consideration of inattention as disease appears to belong to Sir Alexander Crichton, a Scottish doctor at the turn of the 19th century, so prominent that Russian Tsars later wooed him away from their personal physician. At Westminster Hospital in London, he tended to patients afflicted with fevers, coughs, worms, itches, and hysteria, the last of which he found particularly compelling. He spent 6 years writing a 2-volume textbook called An Inquiry into the Nature and Origin of Mental Derangement, in which he explored what he called the cause of insanity and the various diseased affections of the human mind. Considered one of the first English texts to be systematically delineate what we now call psychiatry, he investigated such diverse topics as joy, judgment, and genius. Mental derangement launched Crichton to such lasting prominence in Great Britain that King George IV knighted him. On Attention and Its Diseases receives an entire chapter in Crichton's massive work. It ponders what leads a human mind to concentrate: free will, motivation, education, before describing how among those overly distractible, every impression seems to agitate the person and give him or her unnatural degree of mental restlessness. People walking up and down the room, a slight noise in the same, a moving table, a shuttering, a door suddenly, a slight excess of heat or of cold, too much light or too little light, all destroy constant attention in such patients, inasmuch as it is easily excited by every impression. The barking of dogs, an an ill-tuned organ, or a scolding of a woman are sufficient to distract patients from this description to such a degree as almost approaches the nature of delirium. Notably, soon after Crichton offers this rather stark description of mental disease in adults, his cautious and distractibility in a child was normal, an inherently youthful trait that deserves not to be quelled, but cultivated. Each child, he wrote, has a different, quote, mental diet he can digest. As Crichton put it, with a whiff of autobiography, every public teacher must have observed that there are many to whom the dryness and difficulties of the Latin and Greek grammars are so disgusting that neither of the terrors of the rod nor the indulgence of kind entreaty can cause them to give their attention to them. He lamented that young people unsuited to conventional education methods certainly had other natural talents that should not be labeled dunces during the early part of their lives. Inattention got a little levity in 1845 when the German physicist and psychiatrist Heinrich Hoffmann made a Christmas gift for his 3-year-old son, Carl Philipp. Dr. Hoffmann liked to doodle pictures to soothe crying children, so he wrote an illustrated book of fanciful drawings of quirky boys and girls accompanied by jauntly verse. He called it Shock-Headed Peter. He later expanded it with the story of Little Suckathumb, the story of Augustus, who would not have any soup, and the story of Flying Robert. Among these was a story about Zapple Philip, and alliterative luck would have it, Fidgety Philip, who was annoying his parents at dinner. Fidgety Philip's arithmetic pills. Let me see if Philip can be a little gentleman. Let me see if he is able to sit still for once at table. Thus Papa bade Phil behave, and Mamma looked very grave. But Fidgety Phil, he won't sit still. He wiggles and giggles, and then I declare, swings backwards and forwards and tilts up his chair. Just like any rocking horse, Philip, I am getting cross. Sadly, Hoffman's clearly simple amusement at children's eccentricities, particularly those that drove mom and dad nuts, did not survive the ages. Some 150 years later, as debates began to rage over the existence and medical legitimacy of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD advocates excavated and held up Fidgety Phil as an unassailable proof that the condition had been recognized since way back in the mid-19th century and medically recognized at that, given Hoffman's being a psychiatrist. Today, Fidgety Phil no longer entertains children, but all but diagnoses them. The official definition of ADD, published by the American Psychiatric Association, still honors his little boys with hyperactive symptom number 1, often fidgets with or taps hands or feet. A more formal theory of impulsivity as organic disease arrived in 1902 during a lecture series before the Royal College of Physicians in London called on some abnormal psychical conditions in children. Sir George Frederick Still was a pioneer in the field of pediatrics. At that point, few doctors paid attention to the maladies specific to children, preferring instead to view their bodies as those undersized adults. Dr. Still, what a name though, studied 20 children who exhibited what he called a defect in moral control, characterized by spitefulness, shamefulness, and cruelty, and more appearing most obvious, quote, to the good of others or to the large and more remote good of self. His case illustrates included an 11-year-old boy who could not resist the urge to grab 2 other children and slam their heads together. Kids who showed a, quote, reckless disregard for command and authority, and one who tried to immolate a cat. We have a lot of them today. These children understandably demonstrated what's still called quite abnormal incapacity for sustained attention. He said they were either idiots. Anyway, I threw the link in here. You can see, I'm just going to scroll through so you can see some of the other things, because I'm not, like I said, I won't be able to, I'm not going to sit here and read this entire thing like this. I think the book would be an interesting thing to get and might add it to my list of books to have on my shelf. You know, it's, you know, Alexander Graham Bell makes you know, a thing. They also talk about the IQs, and we often hear that ADHD children tend to be high IQs, so forth and so on. You know, we got Smith and Klein and French, the pharmaceutical landscape. So at this point, the drug business had been overseen by these doctors themselves, and then this lead. So it's got some history in here as well. The link is in the description. But don't blame that. He had a heart defect. Could that possibly, that heart defect, have been what caused him to be hyperactive? I wonder. They say that they don't have any tests. They say that they can't, you know, they can just ask questions. And that is a concern, because that means that there is something that's causing this. I believe, like we've been reading, that the majority of these children are normal, and what we have deemed as non-normal activity is what we're treating these days, but it's actually normal children that are normal. Um, I knew a woman recently whose child all seemed normal to me. And I have some training and some experience, several years worth of working with children that are hyperactivity, wrote several papers about it in college, etc. And it seemed normal, and yet he was completely medded up. And she was very proud of the meds. And he was under 7. He was 7 years old. That is very young. And on top of that, she gave him gummies and whatever else, seemed to work for him. And so that is the millennial parents for you. And so you get, a lot of very interesting stuff in here. I'd be curious to know what you think of what I've read. If you bother to read more, you can share that with me as well. What are your thoughts about the overdiagnosed state of things? It seems like we've got some problems. What's the future hold now? This is a generation that's now becoming parents. They were on these medications as children. They're becoming parents. And I don't know if you've paid attention, but this generation seems to be getting a hit over the head for their parenting skills by the next generation, the Gen Z, Zers, who are becoming, teachers and working with children as they've come into their adulthood, and they're having the millennials children in schools, and they're saying these children are horrible, disrespectful, and rude. And now we have even more kids. And what happens when a baby is born that's mother took ADHD medications or continued to take them during pregnancy, which I also found conflicting. All the science said don't take it when pregnant, causes this, this, this. And then more recently, we have had research papers coming out saying that it's perfectly safe to take during pregnancy. So now you're going to have more pregnant women taking these medications, which you will not see the side effects of that until that generation has children. So it's the grandmothers that are creating the eggs that become the next generation. Baby girls are born with their eggs. They are formed during their fetal stage from what the mother is ingesting. That's her grandchild. And so, just think about these things, putting together pieces, asking questions. That's all we're doing here.